I'm going to show how to make this wavy star pattern using Affinity Photo's Procedural Texture Filter. I like this pattern. It reminds me of an album cover from the 1970s. This pattern makes use of my previous star pattern, and I just added a modulation to the points of the star. So I'm going to show how to add a modulation like that to an existing pattern. For this one, instead of using the cosine function, I switched over to the oscillator sine function. I wanted to see how you would do that. So I'm going to look at what the differences are between cosine and oscillator sine and what you have to do to convert from one to the other in case you wanted to do that. To get started, I'm going to start with a new document. I'll choose the XGA and then change it to 1024 by 1024 pixels. I will make sure it's an RGB8 mode, create that. I'm going to fill it with black, and I'm going to add a live procedural texture filter to this. I'm going to start with a single equation and assign it to all three channels. I'll add a real number input A, and I'll call that scale, and I'll set that to 4 for now. In this example, I thought it'd be nice to show how to position the origin in the center of the image. So to do that, I'm going to start with a variable v equals vec2 of x and y, and then multiply by a and divide by w, now, which is width of the document in pixels. Now if I wanted to scale it to the height rather than the width, I could divide by h. Since they're both the same in this example, it doesn't matter, but if I go up to my document and resize the document and set it to, let's just do 1920 by 1080, and resize that. Now it's a rectangular document. Okay, so this will make a difference. So I could scale it relative to either the width of the document, have 4 repeating factors across the width, or have 4 repeating factors across the height of it. And depending on what I'm doing, I may want to choose one or the other, but I'll just choose W for now. Then to center it, right now my origin's up in the upper left-hand corner, so to center this inside of my vec2, I'm going to subtract the x from the x value, w over 2, and from the y value, h over 2. And that should center it in the middle of the screen, and just to check it, I'm going to do a length of v, because that should appear to be a nice circle. Now if it's oval, I did this before and I came out with an oval shape there, and so that was not good. But this one turned out nicely, and so that's how you should do it. Now I'll go back to document and resize the document and change back to 1024 by 1024. Now the other thing I want to do, I'm going to make a polygon, and so I need the number of sides. I want to put in the number of sides. So I'll use an integer number input, and I'm going to assign that to n, and this will be the number of sides. And I'll just set it up to 3. Now I want to set up a variable that is the angle that's swept by each side. So for example, with a square, each side would occupy 90 degrees of angle. All right, and then the 4 squares is 360 degrees total. So normally, when I set this up, I'd call it variable. I'll use the letter S for this one, and it would be 360 degrees divided by n, the number of sides. I want to set this up using the oscillator sine function instead of the cosine function. The oscillator sine function goes through a full cycle every 2 units. And so instead of 360 degrees, I'm going to use 2 units. So I'll change this from 360 to 2. So it's going to be 2 divided by n, and that'll take me through a full cycle with oscillator sine. So that's one of the changes you have to make to work with the oscillator sine function. Next thing I want to do is create a polar coordinate system. So I'm going to create a variable vp for polar coordinates, and that's going to equal vec2 of a tangent to of v.y comma v.x. This returns a value between minus 180 degrees and 180 degrees, so I'm going to divide by 180 degrees in order to get it into the range from minus 1 to 1. And then for the second component of the polar coordinates, I'm going to put in the length of v, which is sort of like the radius. So I have the angle and the radius. So there's my polar coordinate system. To get started, I'm going to start with just a polygon, and then to make the star, I'm going to have a polygon that's rotated by 1/2 of the sweep angle, and then I'm going to subtract that one from the first one, and that'll give me the star shape. So for the first polygon, I'm going to call that, I'll have a variable theta1, which is going to equal vp.x. So that's just the first angle. And then I'm going to make another angle, theta2, which is equal to theta1 plus half the sweep angle, s over 2. So I have theta1, theta2. Now I'm going to create a theta prime value, which will be the same on every side of the polygon. So it's going to go from minus, for instance, in a square, it'd go from minus 45 degrees up to plus 45 degrees, even though theta is going from minus 180 degrees to plus 180 degrees. Okay, this is going to restrict those values. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the round function to do it this time. So I'll take tp, so I'm going to create a variable tp1, which is equal to round of theta1 over s. And then I'm going to multiply by the sweep angle, and then I'm going to subtract off theta1. So this will go from minus whatever to plus whatever. So in the case of 90 degrees, it's minus 45 to plus 45. All right, I want to create a similar one for my other angle, theta2. So it'll be tp2 equals round of theta2 over s times s minus theta2. Okay, so I have everything set up, and now I'm going to create the star. But to get started, I'll just do a vp.y, which is the radius, times, and now I'm going to use oschsc sine of tp1. And let's look at that. And so there's the basis of the polygon. Now I'll take a smooth step on this to give it an edge, but that's the basic form of it. And so I can change the number of sides, and it creates a nice polygon there with different sides. The next thing I'm going to do is to put this inside of a smoothstepn function, and that will give me a white polygon with a black background. I'll have two different edges, edge 1 and then edge 1 plus edge 2. I'll put in two 0 to 1 range inputs and label the first one E1 and the second one E2. Okay, and so let's turn this one off. So this one controls the size of the polygon now, and then this one sort of smooths out the rough edges. So I can give it just a little bit of that and change the sides. I found out that these edges sometimes are going to have to be really small. So it will be helpful if I add a real input, label it E3, and I'll just set that to 1 for now. So I'm going to call this one the edge. I'm just going to call this one the edge smooth, and I'm going to call this one the edge divisor, I guess. So I'm going to divide it by this one. I'm going to divide E1 by E3. And I'm going to put E1 and E2, E1 plus E2 in parentheses, and divide that by E3. And that'll give me a control so that when these are real close to 0, I'll be able to move this up, and then I'll be able to move these out farther. Right now it looks like I don't need that, but when I make it into a star with many points, I will need that capability. The other thing I'd like to do is to be able to rotate this, because when I have a pentagon, I sort of like to have the point pointing up. So if I add a angle input, and I'll label it phi for, I guess, phase, and I'll just call it angle. And if I set that to 270 degrees, in order to use that, I have to add it to my angle returned by the arctangent function before I divide by 180 degrees. So I'm going to add my pH here. Alright, so now I can change the direction of this, and I'll just leave it down here at 270 where the point is pointing straight up. So I've got the polygon, and I want to make a star. To do the star shape, I need a multiplier. I'm going to put in a -1 to 1 range input. I'll label that I1, and that will be my star shaping control. So I'm going to control the amount of the size of the second polygon. If I just subtract them, this will make a mess. So if I add the star shape, that'll allow me to control the size of that. Now I'm going to put parentheses after the vp.y, so after I multiply by the radius, I want to put parentheses around the angle, and I'm going to take the difference of these two angles. So I'm going to take minus I1 times oscillator oschsin of TP2. And I've got to add another parentheses. So now I can make it into a rounded star or a pointy star. So there's my star shape. Now when I get to a large number of points, it gets sort of rounded and it's hard to make this pointy. So I am going to put in another variable b, which I'm going to label star length. This will help me to make a very pointy star when I have a large number of sides to it, or points to it. In order to do this, I did some experimenting with this, and it turns out I'm going to change this I1 into a little function here, and have it 1 plus I1 divided by b. So it'll be very close to 1, but just a little bit off. Let's make it like that. Okay, so if I bring the edge down now, and I bring this down to here, and then I can control, I'm going to turn that down a little bit. There's my pointy star. So now I've got the pointy star. I can control the edge, and this will help me to adjust that to make it more pointed. And it'd be nice if I figured out a formula that sort of does everything at once, but this isn't too bad. There, so now I have enough room to put some waves on here. And so I'm going to add that, and I'm going to go back to my actually my VP coordinate system, and I'm going to add the wave part in there. And for my wave, I'm going to have an amplitude, so I'll put in a -1 to 1 slider. I'll label that one I2, and this is going to be the wave intensity or wave amplitude. And then I'm going to need a wave frequency, and that will just be an F. So I'll have use the letter F for that one. I'll label this wave frequency, and then I think I'll just put in a 1 for that now, and then let's try that. So I have an amplitude and a frequency. Now where should I put in the wave? Now to add the waviness to the star, I don't want to modify this VP, and I want to create a new VP polar coordinate system that I'm going to be using after that point. So I'm going to change this one to vp0, and then I'm going to insert a new polar vector coordinate system. So it'll be a vector variable vp, and this is going to be vp0 plus my waviness factor. Okay, so the wave factor I'm going to create by making another vector, a vec2, and it's going to consist of 2 parts. The first part will be I2 times, and I'm going to use a harmonic oscillator, and I'll use the S curve oscillator, and then it'll be just F, the frequency, and I want the frequency to go out along the radius. And so the radius I can get from VP, I call it VP0 now, dot Y, and that should do it. And add a semicolon, and so I've sort of added on to my VP, now VP0, and made a new VP that will be applied to the rest of these. Okay, when I recorded this, I missed a little detail here, and that is I didn't have a second element to my vector, my 2-element vector. And so that would have added this whole oscillator to both the angle and the radius. I don't want that. I don't need to add anything to the radius. I'll just have a 0 for the second component of that. VP0 already has length of V for the second component. So I'll put a 0 in here, and that should take care of that. And so there it is. So if I can add this, and it is quite wavy. And that's quite a bit, and so I can increase the frequency here, make it look really crazy, or decrease the frequency and just have 1. But it's very sensitive, and I messed around with this for a while until I found some factors that made it a little better. And the thing that helped was to add another real number input to sort of scale this and sort of rein it in. I'll just leave it with the variable C, and this will be the wave power. And I'm going to add, I'll set it up just as 1 right now. Instead of using the oscillator SC, I'm going to divide that by a factor that is a power that's 1 plus vp0.y, so the radius, raised to the c power. So I'm going to divide it by the radius raised to some power. So it'll start off at 1, and then it'll decrease as you move away from the origin. And there it is with a power of 1, but then as I increase this, it sort of straightens out as I move away. So I can add this, and it starts out real wavy and then decreases as I move away from the origin. Now the last thing I want to do is add a gradient map to this, and I have one that I liked. I chose this one, which I originally used to set up a copper pattern that's sort of a corroded copper. But in order to view this, I want to have a larger smooth edge on this. I'm going to make that bigger. Something like that. And then I'll just go over I could drop this down on top here. Let's go over the gradient map I used in case you want to duplicate this exactly. And so starting out at 0, I have HSL values of 43, 34, 71. At 4%, HSL is 153, 49, 67. At 13%, HSL of 0, 41, 25. At 25%, I have an HSL of 27, 74, 59. At 50%, I have an HSL of 15, 72, 32. At 60%, I have HSL of 11, 82, 22. At 63%, I have HSL 348, 39, 18. At 76%, I have HSL of 10, 83, 36. And I go dark. At 84%, I have an HSL of 350, 26, 13. Then at 93%, I have HSL 172, 80, 23. And at 100%, I have HSL 192, 83, 21. Alright, so that's how you can make a wavy star pattern, but also a way you can add modulation to the points on a polar function. So you can add this waviness. Now, when I first started doing this, I accidentally applied this to the wrong factor, and so I had different length points coming out from my star. And I'm going to show that in a later video, but you can see if you can figure out how to do that where it's modulating the different points. Another thing you can do with this is, now that I have this set up, I can change my the waveform that I'm modulating this with and just use a linear, and so it'll have this sort of zigzag edge to it. Or I could use one of the other, any of the other waveforms to modulate this, like a CS, where it has this sort of rounded shape, and that one looks a little bit too extreme. But if you decrease this a little bit, or you can push them off like that, so that's more extreme. And then you could do a, any of the other ones like the RT, will give you sort of this sort of insect leg looking effect, something like that. I sort of just like the smooth curve SC effect the most, I guess. That's the wavy star pattern. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.